Where do I suffer? Do I suffer in my romantic relationships, in my career? Sometimes this is all of it, right? Do I suffer in terms of my interpersonal relationship, in terms of myself? What is my inner dialogue like? You know, how am I actually treating myself? Because that is usually a reflection of our early relationship with our parents and our sort of family members and our society at large. And we learn to do the same things they did to us, but we do it over and over and over and over again. And the reason we do that is because that's how we survived. And if you're still alive, then, oh, it must have worked. And so that perpetuates this vicious cycle of self-criticism, self-abuse that leads to further suffering. And so that's why inherently the mind is negative, because we're wired for survival and nothing ever, pleasant killed you.
Hi, this is Tim Westbrook. Welcome to I Love Being Sober. We talk about life and recovery, mental health, biohacking, alternative therapies, and everything related to living a kick-ass sober life. So let's dig in.
Welcome back to I Love Being Sober. Today, I'm excited to sit down with Wesley Kress, practitioner, speaker, and founder of Breakthrough Performance Rehab. Wes's work is unique. He brings together genomics, functional medicine, Eastern wisdom, and somatic healing to bridge the gap between physical performance and deep inner transformation. His mission is to help people unravel chronic patterns, restore vitality, and reclaim the youth of who they are. In this conversation, we're going to explore what really drives healing beyond surface level fixes. We'll talk about the myth of the inaccurate body, the role of courageous conversations, the shadow side of exercise, and why unresolved trauma may be the most overlooked factor in disease. So let's dive in. Wes, welcome to the show. I'm so glad that you're here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Tim. It's so great to finally connect. I know I've watched your podcast for a while and you've had so many great guests. You're incredible. Your journey, I've obviously followed and had deep admiration for. So it's so great to be here and having this conversation.
Yeah, love it. And for more context, I see Wes basically on a weekly basis. So I've gotten to experience working with him. I've been seeing you for what? Probably a couple years.
Yes, over a couple years. Yes.
And so I've gone through lots of difficult times. And I mean, Wes is the guy that I see. And I mean, geez, there was a period of time where I would literally go in there and cry.
Yes.
And I want to work out with the NeuFit, which is one of the modalities at your facility. And I like doing the NeuFit because it's like a workout and it also works on the nervous system. We'll talk a little bit more about the NeuFit. And then a lot of times you would say, let's do acupuncture today.
Yes.
Which was always what I needed.
Totally. Yeah. And I think that's part of healing, is that sometimes the things that we need the most aren't the things that we necessarily gravitate towards. And part of it is obviously exercise and things like that are so therapeutic for our healing process. And at the same time, someone like yourself, who's a high performer, CEO, and sort of have so much on your plate, at times, what we actually need is more spaciousness in our experience. And the way we do that is actually through resetting the entire nervous system. So acupuncture really helps with downregulating the amygdala and allowing the parasympathetic nervous system to upregulate. And so life is oftentimes always coming at us. At least that's what it feels like when we're stressed and sort of contracted. And so the ability to allow the nervous system to shift back into this state of receptivity allows us to start to actually experience life coming at us in a way that is actually easier than if we are functioning in this sort of resistance, fight or flight state that a lot of us experience day to day. And so I attribute, your openness and readiness to the ability to go through some of the things that we went through in the clinic. And that's just, I think, a lot of the work you've done, your journey, your path, your ability to stay present with the difficulties of the human experience. The human experience is quite challenging because it encompasses every part of our past in the present. And so you were going through periods of your life that were bringing up things in the past and as well as things that we were navigating in the present. in terms of trying to navigate so much at once. And you were able to stay present with your emotions. And crying is one of the things that helps regulate the nervous system. And oftentimes as men, we think like, oh, crying, this is not what we're supposed to do.
Right.
But actually, it's the most powerful thing to bring us back into a state of receptivity, which is the state of the parasympathetic nervous system. So this allows us to restore and rejuvenate so that then we can have the energy and the resilience to move forward in our life.
Right. And that's been my experience.
Yes.
Yep.
Amazing.
Okay, let's go back. Okay, I've got some questions here.
Yes.
So you're a licensed acupuncturist,
Yes.
and you have your Master's of Science in Oriental Medicine,
Yes.
and you have your MBA.
Yes.
So what does all of this mean? And a lot of times, I've referred lots of people to you, and a lot of times they say, "Well, what is he? Well, what are his credentials?" So tell me about those credentials and tell me what those mean.
Yeah. So I think in combination with those credentials, I'll step back and just say that sort of my whole life path sort of led me to where I'm at today. So over 30,000 hours of direct experience through my own trauma, through having chronic illness. And that was essentially what led me to start to study medicine. And then the emotional trauma that took place from sexual trauma from 4 to 13 led me down a path of trying to understand healing at every level. And so I think the combination of both direct experience and academia is where we get embodied intelligence. And so a lot of times, we're trying to understand reality through the mind alone. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, there's sort of this intersection where the mind is sort of like a map. The map is sort of trying to guide you, but it's not a replacement for reality. And we live in a world that's very highly intellectualized because we live in the information age, right? The fact we're doing this podcast, the fact that we have the internet, we are essentially gifted with so much information in abundance. And at the same time, that can be overwhelming to the nature of the nervous system, because if everything is filtered through the mind, and that mind is largely constructed through our beliefs, through our conditioning, and through the constructs and ideas that we were given early on, and that we evolve over time, that is sort of a piece of reality. But the truth of reality actually lives in the body. And so a lot of this is something that I always say that like most of medicine right now is kind of in this like top-down approach. Mm-hmm. Right? Where we're trying to navigate everything from the top down, which is the intellect, which is trying to understand the nature of like how to control certain things. And a lot of ancient wisdom was about the body and the emotions and the nervous system and what were the best ways to help facilitate change. And so when I was going through my school progression, I did undergraduates in marketing and finance, and then I did my MBA in finance, accounting, and then a specialty in investing. And a lot of this was we managed money for the state of New Mexico, and we got to implement what it would be like to work in a financial firm where you did portfolio management, equity analysis, and fixed income analysis. And a lot of business in terms of the way they look at the financial world is through models. And these economic models and financial models are determined based on the environment. And what I realized in medicine was that those things were actually more accurate than the nature of reductionist medicine models that look at isolated variables, look at a linear progression, and then a hierarchical model that happened to be a reductionist way of thinking. And when I started to study Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine and a little bit of functional medicine, they were much more flexible in their application of models the way economics and finance was. Mm-hmm. And I started to realize like, oh, actually, this is actually the more accurate way of understanding human health. And the reason that is because our human health is really based on a complex system. Mm-hmm. And so complex systems can't be reduced to single variables. They have to be affected through the system-wide approaches. And so things like acupuncture actually are affecting the entire system rather than a single variable. And so the leverage on that is so much higher, right? And so the impact is that you can impact entire emergent patterns, which, you deal with obviously a lot of addiction and so forth, but addiction is really a result of trauma. And so it's just an adaptation to avoid pain, which is a survival mechanism. And so this idea that we should shame, blame, and guilt people who have addictions is ultimately just a misunderstanding, right? Mm-hmm. But because of the social constructs of domestication, where we typically, when we're growing up, we do something wrong, what do? We shame, blame, and guilt someone to do something better. But guess what? Where the trauma is, it's actually as a result of that shame, blame, and guilt. And so this is what we call a vicious cycle in the nature of complex systems. So vicious cycles mean that whatever the symptom or sign is, it actually then further creates the problem. So if you're stressed and you can't sleep, guess what that does? It causes more stress, right? If you're depressed and you can't eat, guess what? You don't want to eat anymore, or you eat too much. So these vicious cycles perpetuate themselves. And so trying to get out of them is like trying to get out of quicksand. The harder you try, the deeper you go. And I think everyone can relate to being in a vicious cycle where it feels like you're in hell. You're just in this vicious cycle spiral downward. Well, there is the same thing of this on the opposite side in terms of virtuous cycles. And virtuous cycles are like spirals up. And I think conceptual spiritual traditions have discussed this as heaven. And essentially, how do you shift those polarities is you have to do that from a system-wide approach. So a lot of my clinic is combining the deep depth of understanding of both direct experience and models that are more like network models and models that actually mirror complex systems. So that's like Ayurvedic medicine and Chinese medicine. And that's where my formalized training comes in. Is essentially you have 5 years of schooling that you get both in Western medicine and Eastern medicine. And acupuncture is just a tool within that handbag, but really it's the entire theory of understanding how do you look at the body from more of an ecosystem than like a machine.
So when is acupuncture appropriate for somebody?
Yeah, so acupuncture really is as appropriate for someone in almost all cases, except for the nature of if they sort of have some adverse relationship with it. And I say that from the standpoint of like some people don't like needles. So in that case, you might do more somatic work and body work. Acupuncture is just a conduit into the nervous system. And where the needles are placed are actually affecting the network brain regions, right? I think in the clinic here, you use TMS, right? And something that's very, very effective. But a lot of TMS is really like based on network regions. And the reason Chinese medicine is so powerful is that it mapped these ecosystems within our body long time ago. So there's really no such thing as like meridians. In the same way, there's no such thing as like longitude and latitude lines on a globe. They're maps. And this is where people are like, oh, well, what is qi? What is, yin and yang? It's like, all it is a model. If you walked into an algebra class or a calculus and started saying like, what is y equals mx plus b, or what is like the formulations, it would be like, well, are those real? It's like, no, they're pointing to something that's real, but they themselves are not inherently real. And so that's where I think a lot of confusion comes is people are like, well, what's qi? What's yin yang? It's like, yin and yang is just a model of binary code. In fact, Boolean logic essentially was born out of the I Ching, which then gave way to modern day computing. And that is all based off of sort of Chinese theory, Chinese medicine, Chinese metaphysics, and the basis of what actually born out Chinese medicine. And so these models are just a lot more effective because not only are they natural models, but they're models based off of complex systems and networks rather than this sort of reductionist way of looking at isolated variables that are supposedly linear and can be isolated, which we all know is not the case, right? If you take a medication or if you take some sort of intervention, usually it's going to impact the whole system, right? So what is a more effective way is to understand interventions that have an ability to affect the entire system with very low risk of adverse effects. So acupuncture is one of the safest procedures. And so to answer like, what is it good for? It's effective for many things in terms of, pain is the primary thing that people look at when they think about it, but really anything to do with chronic illness, such as inflammatory based diseases, which are pretty much prevalent across the board. Inflammation is, it improves enkephalins, endorphins, it reduces the stress response. It's great for PTSD. It's great for any type of anxiety or depression in terms of emotional processing. I know you've experienced this directly when you come in the clinic. You're going through a really intense emotional experience. And what it does is just allows you to metabolize the emotions and stay within the body. So the body and the breath are the thing that are always present. And acupuncture helps the nervous system regulate in such a way that it's not so overwhelming, and it can allow you to regulate and breathe and metabolize those intense emotions that you're going through.
So when I do acupuncture, you're putting the little needles all over me, right?
Yes.
Do you always put the needles in the same place, or do you place them in different spots?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Definitely what we're doing is we're looking at the pattern, how your nervous system is oriented and what experiences you're having in terms of emotions, in terms of any symptoms or signs. And then we're placing that pattern inappropriate to where you're at that current moment. And the flexibility of acupuncture is essentially, it takes a very long time to become a master, because you're ultimately trying to understand the nature of where that person is at in terms of out of balance. And you're trying to create the code, so to speak, in terms of the placement of the needles to bring them back into balance. It would be like if you were deciding to go into a place that needed a digital code and you didn't know the digital code, right? It would just, access wasn't granted, right? And that's sort of how like acupuncture really can't disrupt things. But if you happen to know the code to bring it back into balance, access granted. And you can feel that shift in the nervous system. And so all of these patterns that are emergent from the way the body adapts, because all disease and sickness is really an adaptation. It's a compensation. And what we're looking at is what is those compensations and adaptations that you're having right now? And how do we support the system to come back into a state of balance and efficiency so that it's not having to compensate and reduce its overall energy expenditure in inefficient ways? And by doing so, we move it closer to a virtuous cycle rather than a vicious cycle.
And how often does acupuncture work? Like you have someone sit down and you do the acupuncture, and I've done it and it takes like an hour. And at the end of the hour, it feels like 5 minutes.
Yes.
and how often do you see, does anybody ever say, oh, wow, I don't feel any different?
Yeah, I would say that, obviously acupuncture is similar to most sort of skilled expertise professions, that it is somewhat contingent on the ability to apply it.
Okay.
And that expertise could cause someone to not experience anything. I would say that there are some people that are highly in their head and they're trying to analyze that. And so they may not even experience change or so dissociated from their body. A lot of the things I do differently than a lot of acupuncturists, and this is my integration of sort of a lot of different areas, is I'm using somatic body work, which is a form of Tui Na, which is Chinese medical massage, incorporated with the acupuncture. So what this does is accelerate the direction, and touch in particular affects something called C fibers. They're slow myelinated fibers in the skin that actually help with emotional processing. And so this combined with Tui Na and the cranial sacral work that I do helps accentuate the vagus nerve stimulation. And so the needles are really sort of the direction to help balance the pattern. And then I'm taking broader approaches, but people theoretically may not notice such a difference if they're really in balance. So for instance, like if you're really hydrated and I'm like, give you a glass of water, you might be like, I don't notice anything different. But then if, you're really dehydrated, you've just done, a 50-mile bike ride and you didn't have any water, and I give you a glass of water, you're like, wow, that was the best thing ever. And that's essentially the difference with like the different medicines, right? Is like Western medicine's forcing an effect. Chinese medicine is guiding an effect. It's communicating with the body rather than overriding it. And so that is why the side effects aren't taking place. If the body and nervous system need that rebalancing, it will receive it, that communication will connect, and change will pursue, and we only experience relative change. And that's why water, which is like essential, is a good analogy, because like if you need water is like, wow, that's the best thing ever.
It's the best thing ever, yeah.
But if you don't, it's like, I don't notice anything. So that's why it's a little bit difficult. I always recommend if people are really stressed or going through a really significant emotional experience, go get acupuncture and then tell me if you notice it works.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I can tell you that every time I do acupuncture, when I'm stressed and spinning out, it's like, oh, I feel better.
Yes. Yes, it's able to shift the nervous system in such a way that your entire experience of reality changes. And that is sort of narrowing down the nature of a lot of what acupuncture is. It's very sophisticated in its ability to affect consciousness. And consciousness is sort of like where we get caught in different experiences of our perception of reality through different emotional states. And a lot of those emotional states are from the past, but they definitely impact our perception of the present. And so with acupuncture, it's able to shift you into a state of safety, which is ventral vagal. And that allows you to feel connected to yourself, others, and have a sense of like receptivity to reality. So stress isn't really the problem if in fact our nervous systems can receive. That is the nature of restoration and rejuvenation, is our nervous system now has the ability to receive things that are coming at it. But if it's maintaining in a contracted stress state, anything that's coming at us feels overwhelming.
Let's talk about durability. How long, like if someone does acupuncture, like how long should it last for? How long should that feeling last for?
Yeah, I think that the nature of these things are dependent or contingent on the patterns that the person is dealing with and the other supporting factors. So for instance, if the person is in a significant amount of pathological patterns, for instance, they come in the clinic, their sleep is really horrible, they're not eating well, and maybe they're in an addiction sort of state where they're constantly using, the acupuncture will help to the degree that they're able to sort of start to shift out of those patterns. And so how long it lasts is really contingent on the nature of other variables. If someone comes in, they're really healthy, they're exercising, they're sleeping well, I mean, one session could last for months, if not longer, right? Because it depends on the strength of the other supporting factors. We're sort of like coming in, we're recalibrating the nature of the nervous system, taking it back to you could say 0 point, where it feels very centered. And that ability to stay in that state is largely contingent on their conditioned self, which is sort of this framework of like how we experience reality based on our upbringing, our beliefs, our traumas, our ways of perceiving self and others in the world, and our sort of thought patterns. And those things can shift us out. But ultimately, acupuncture is going to be a lot stronger than, say, going to a therapy session only, because a therapy session might be able to give you a better story and how to reframe it. But what acupuncture is doing is going to the core of the issue. And what I mean by that is like, it's your experience of those things, right? It's not actually the thing itself. For instance, if I'm sure you have something in your past where you've dealt with something that you've sort of had a difficult time with, and then you've healed from that. And what I mean by that is when you think about it, you don't have that emotional pain.
I'm okay.
Right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's quite significant in the fact that like you could tell the story however you want now. It doesn't really matter. Right? Because the only thing that really mattered was your painful nature of the emotions of the experience, which is largely located in the nervous system. So we're going to the root of actually why the stories matter rather than trying to reframe the stories themselves. Because just by telling a better story, yeah, you can slightly shift someone's perspective, but that emotional pain is still there. And what we want to do is create a body-based approach where we're able to process the emotions, relax the body, and then regulate the nervous system. And then it's like turning a dial on, the radio station, right? It's like, oh, wow, entire different amount of content is coming through me, right? Because I'm entirely experiencing reality different. And I didn't have to tell you anything. All I had to do was change the station tuning, which is the nervous system, the body, and ultimately the emotional state. And by doing so, that's a lot more strong than simply someone tells your perspective and then you're like, oh, I need to go read another affirmation or get a quote or have my therapist tell me how to reframe this. It's limited in its impact. It's the same thing with exercise, right? You go exercise versus, and all of a sudden your state changes. You're like better able to deal with a difficult emotional conversation.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So it's body-based approaches that are always going to be the longest lasting. And emotional integration largely in psychiatry and psychology is focused on reframing and trying to help you navigate within the mind rather than focusing on self-love and also helping you why that the compensations you have were just an adaptation and that they're not your fault, but they are your responsibility to sort of navigate and rebalance.
So who is your, I know you see professional athletes, you see a wide range of people at your clinic. Who is a good client for you?
Yeah, I would say, to simplify it, it's really people that are ready to go down the path of healing.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by the path of healing, the word healing comes from the word wholeness.
Mm-hmm.
And so healing really involves every layer: the mental, the emotional, the spiritual, and the physical.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that can be somewhat hesitant for the lay person,
Mm-hmm.
because they're like, oh, well, I have an issue and I think that my body's broken. My approach is like, your body's not broken,
Right.
your body's accurate. And let's figure out why it's experiencing itself the way it is, because of something from the past. And then all of the emergent patterns in terms of how you compensated and tried to navigate those imbalances. And so the person who is ready to sort of like go down some of these more uncomfortable processes and be ready to sort of navigate that is really the person who comes to see me. And that's a lot of times, yeah, it's athletes. Sometimes it's everyday people who are ready to actually not just cope with their situation, but transform their situation, right? There's a difference between coping and transformation. Transformation is basically exiting the way you experience things into a completely different paradigm. And that can be quite uncomfortable. And it's also much more long lasting. Right. Whereas coping is like, okay, let me give you something to cope with the issues that are going on, and it'll help you navigate them better, but you still have those issues going on. Like, let's look at why those issues are there, why there were emergent patterns from the past. And some of this is just, we're not taught self-love because we are wired for social survival.
Right.
So anything that your parents wired in terms of their social survival is what they taught you. And that's eating, nutrition, exercise, relationships. How do we communicate? How do we talk? All those things, every part of that is our nervous systems communicating with each other. Right. And whether you feel safe around someone or you don't feel safe is largely due to a lot of these variables.
Right. So you end up with professional athletes, elite athletes, and so when they're coming to see you, it's not just for, like when I started working with you, I started working with the NeuFit, and we're going to talk about the NeuFit here in a little bit. And so most of the people, when they first come to you, do they come to you thinking that they're gonna get more fit and they're gonna work on their physical performance, and then next thing you know, they're talking about their emotional and spiritual health and their fitness?
Yeah, I always say that I meet everyone where they're at. So when they come to see me, it's not like I'm taking them somewhere where they don't want to go. I just meet you and guide you.
Right.
And so I would say there is some people that will come to me, and before you know it, they recognize that there's things that, especially when working with the newbie is sort of bringing the body into a state of electrical charge and opening that actually is a conduit to processing emotions, if that person chooses to, right? It's kind of like you go to massage, you get really relaxed, you open up. All of a sudden you start becoming conversationalist and you talk and you like open up. Well, that's the same thing. The newbie exercises that way too, but the newbie is an accentuation of that. And so when people come in, I really give them an opportunity to do these things all simultaneously. Whereas like normal medicine, traditional medicine is compartmentalize everything. And that's part of the issue, is like everything is seen as separate from itself. And it's like our whole body works together. Right. So it's like when you come in the clinic, I'm looking at what are the best levers to pull to create the greatest transformation in the most efficient process for you. And so sometimes that is doing just the newbie. Sometimes that's newbie with the acupuncture. Sometimes that's just acupuncture, right? If you're really depleted, you're going a lot of stress, you need restoration, restorative practices and techniques. And so I really meet people where they're at. And sometimes, again, I always say like people are just sometimes more in pain or more confused than the other. And a lot of the frameworks that we have in traditional society kind of like almost prey on these vicious cycles. And I think that's where there's misaligned incentives economically through Western medicine, not necessarily through Western science, which is really based on inquiry and data and science. it's Western medicine that's very motivated through certain economic incentives, and that's the issue. And that distinction's important. Western science is fine; it's great.
What is the difference between Western science and Western medicine? I want to go back to the newbie because we need to give people more context as to what the newbie is. But what's the difference between Western medicine and Western science?
Yeah, so Western medicine is really a form of inquiry, looking at data and observation, and they use, largely the scientific model, and they look at reductionist ways of viewing things. Although I would say Western science is evolving more to look like Ayurvedic and Chinese medicine models. So if you look up complex systems biology, complex systems pharmaceuticals, or pharmacology, complex systems pharmacology, those are actually starting to look at things in a sort of distributed, dynamic, and interdependent way, which is the way complex systems actually work. And so I do see this sort of advancement in Western sciences. What I'm sort of like, we're unlikely to see is that science translates into Western treatments, because Western treatments are built around an economic and financial model that has nothing to do with Western science.
Okay.
And it has a relationship. I should say nothing to do. It has a relationship, but it's not like, you advance Western sciences and you find this out and all of a sudden we're going to incorporate that into Western medicine. No, that's like, business than anything. It's based off of incentives. And those incentives don't necessarily have patients at the central point of care. It has it at the sort of down the totem pole, right? It's a sort of a byproduct of the financial incentives. And so people are treated more like commodities rather than actual people that are trying to heal, right? And so this is where that distinction is a really important distinction, because I think people think that Western science is going to advance and then all of a sudden Western medicine is going to improve. And we have not seen that. And I don't think that will come about if, in fact, we don't change the incentive models, because ultimately they're largely pharmaceutical based. They're largely, surgical based. They're really good for emergency type procedures, but not so good for healing and chronic illness. And especially on the approach of the body and the emotions and the nervous system, which again, I would say is like 80% of health. And the other 20% is largely dictated through more physical based medicine. Right. So physical based medicine being nutrition, biochemistry, genetics or genomics, and then epigenetics is kind of like the lever in between those that are interacting with the environment, with your entire situation, and what genes get turned on and off based off of the emergent pattern of your lifestyle.
Okay, that was a lot. So when you say reductionist, let's go back to that. What do you mean when you say reductionist way of thinking?
Yeah, so what reductionist way of thinking is, it's a Western way of thinking where you basically try to zoom in to the smallest part and make sense of the whole.
Okay.
Right. So it's like, okay, I'm going to zoom in as far as I can, and I'm going to try to make sense of the entire whole. It would be like, if I decided to study Romeo and Juliet, and I was like, oh, okay, like I kind of really understood all the words, the paragraphs. I'm going to like just study the letters as if I'm going to derive more understanding. And this is where like Western understanding and Eastern really are perfect if they married each other, because the zooming in is very powerful. But it's like if you used a telescope and all you could see was this grain of sand and you didn't zoom out, you would miss a lot of reality. And so reductionist is about looking at an isolated variable and essentially creating a hierarchy of it, and then trying to see what's its cause and effect on the system. But the problem is that thinks it's siloed. So it doesn't have a great ability to be flexible in its understanding of how, like when I move this variable, how it affects all the other variables. So the non-reductionist view is to say that the part matters.
So hold on. So this is I think I have a good way to think about it, which is if my hip hurts, it's like, oh, my hip hurts. I need to ice my hip. I need to stretch my hip, and it's like, it's not your hip. It's like down in your ankle. Right? It's kind of that's kind of the same type of thing. It's like just where you have the injury isn't necessarily where the injury is stemming from. The injury is really stemming from somewhere else in your body.
It can be.
Because everything is connected. Yeah.
Yes, everything is connected. So there's a relationship, and that's where the other model is, right? So think about reductionist models. they're looking at things from a linear standpoint. They're meaning like, okay, it continues to go in a specific direction, right? At a consistent pace, right? They're isolated and they're hierarchical. So isolated means like it tries to separate that out of the other parts. The other models are essentially distributed, meaning they're sort of like different nodes on a network are distributed, right, in different parts. They are dynamic, meaning one node moves, the other nodes have to actually change the way they're communicating with that node, and they're interdependent. So the moment that one moves, the other ones are moving with it. So that's more accurate in terms of looking at the system, right? It's like, if I were to give, there's like a simple understanding is like Western medicine isolates the part in exclusion of the whole, not that it doesn't actually care for the whole, but its emphasis is on the part. And that's really powerful in infectious disease and emergency medicine, because you're willing to sort of focus in on that, even so you can save the person's life, right? But in the whole is the primary focus and the part is secondary, right? It's emphasis, right? So you're looking at the whole as the primary emphasis, and that actually allows you to get closer to wholeness, because healing comes from wholeness, and wholeness is the ability to account for all the variables without trying to isolate one into a reductionist way. Now, with that said, there can be tremendous insights from looking at things in a reductionist way, as long as you remember to zoom out. So this was a lot of my own path. I studied all forms of medicine, over 30,000 hours in functional medicine and Western sciences. I didn't really study too much into the therapeutics of Western medicine, except for the ones that I absolutely needed. Largely because, again, it's not necessarily where healing per se is going to come from. It's like you've seen probably billions, if not trillions of dollars go into like cancer research, finding a cure, or AIDS. It's like, it's never coming because they're looking at it fundamentally flawed, right? It's like, if you look at something in a certain way and expect a specific outcome, sometimes it's the way you're looking at it. And that is definitely the case here, is that essentially we have to look at things differently. And that's where this model is attempting to do, is to look at it from the standpoint of a complex systems approach. And that complex systems approach is the ability to see how those variables are interdependent, they're interactive, they're dynamic, and they're distributed in such a way that the interventions must account for the whole primarily, first and foremost, and then secondarily the part. Because if we focus on the whole, the part will move towards the whole.
Gotcha. So what happened in your life that caused you to be so passionate about healing?
Yeah, I would say that I was the direct result of the experience of, I would say, the most nth degree of human suffering. So I was 4 years old, was born into a cult religion called the 2x2s. It was one of the world's most secretive religious cult. Recently, the FBI tied 900 different pedophiles to the organization. But essentially, I was sexually raped from age 4 to 13. And from age 7, I started developing a lot of really extraordinary physical signs and symptoms. So both in the nature of like skin issues, digestive issues, depression, anxiety. And then I started experiencing even more and more severe issues as I started to study to try to get better. So I started studying, obviously, spirituality and healing, because I felt like I was fractured or fragmented in a million different ways. And so my experience of reality at that juncture was one of tremendous suffering and tremendous pain. And that is what led me down the path of this. And so a lot of the way I studied things wasn't because, I need to take a test. It was like, if I don't correct this, like I should probably exit because like ultimately my quality of life was so horrible. And so like if you have back pain, you're pretty motivated to do something about the back pain. Right. Well, just think about that from a broad systemic layer. And so that's what led me to seek truth, right? Was like, if this was the truth of reality, how horrible it was. But what I realized and what I understood through healing was that it was my experience of reality. And that was largely dictated through, this significant amount of trauma that my nervous system and my body endured and that all the symptoms and signs, which at its peak state was 70 different signs and symptoms, 4 autoimmune diseases, and I was bedridden at 19. I always joke in my own mind, I'm like, I felt like I was 100 years old. And people oftentimes use age as a way, and it definitely has a significant relationship. But like today I experience at 36, like I have no pain. I experience, liberation in terms of emotional stability, and I have no suffering. So it's like age is a relationship, but it's not necessarily like the direct reason for a lot of people's suffering. And yet at the same time, we often write it off as that way because most people don't realize like how important it is to go back into their childhood and to look at all of these things in terms of your conditioning, your trauma, your emotions. And I assure you that every single person, regardless if they didn't go through the severity that I went through, have experienced tremendous amount of suffering. That's a large degree of the human experience. And what we're trying to get back to is this state of liberation that we all remember, but we ultimately don't experience. And so that's part of why even spirituality exists and so forth, is it exists. There's something not quite right in our experience. And so all of these areas led me to look at every layer of healing and medicine, not look at, I didn't have a choice, right? I think you go into specialty in medicine, you have one thing and you just look at that. And it can be, specialty medicine can be very beneficial, but healing, because of the nature of how it derives from wholeness, you kind of need to understand how each system's impacting the other. And so you kind of need to go deep in every single layer. And if you don't, it's going to be difficult to know where to pull the lever. And so my path was sort of born out of my own direct experience. And I always kind of thought like, okay, at 19, I had emotional triggers and physical triggers and environmental triggers that caused me to be completely dysregulated all the time. I couldn't even go into public without having severe reactions physically, all my symptoms and signs. And to experience the opposite of that today just tells me that like everyone's having a slightly different experience of reality based on their past. And that's why when they're in the present and it gets activated, some of those wounds within their nervous system, unprocessed emotions that are impacting our physical state, immediately they start to actually go into these like, what we say is like, we're not doing so well today, right? And it's touching on that piece. It's not so much the piece that's happening right now, it's that piece is touching on the past. And so really, if we are able to heal and process and reconnect to all those pieces, then you don't have triggers. Like I haven't experienced a trigger in 3 years. So it's like,
amazing. It's
incredible. I mean, if you were to ask me that at 19, I would have thought like the world was hell. And today, if you ask me, I was like, the world's heaven. So was it heaven or hell? It was my experience of it. And it was really dictated based off of my upbringing and my experience and my conditioning. And my nervous system was trying to protect me from everything and everyone, because the cult I grew up in thought that everyone that wasn't within our cult was evil, going to a lost eternity, and they were dangerous. And my nervous system wired that way. And then you have the sexual trauma. And then I had certain genetics and epigenetic things that I later found out that were further contributing to the physical disease processes that I also corrected. And so all of these things were playing a role, but absolutely the nervous system and the trauma and the unprocessed emotion were playing 80% of the role.
So how does a person start to look at their issues? They're like, how does a person know that they've got these issues and these traumas that they need to work through? And how do they even, like, where do they start?
Yeah, I think it's, the way you start is, where do I suffer? I mean, if I were to say like just one simple question, that would be the most broad way to start, is like, where do I suffer? Do I suffer in my romantic relationships, in my career? Sometimes this is all of it, right? Do I suffer in terms of my interpersonal relationship, in terms of myself? What is my inner dialogue like? How am I actually treating myself? Because that is usually a reflection of our early relationship with our parents and our sort of family members and our society at large. And we learn to do the same things they did to us, but we do it over and over and over and over again. And the reason we do that is because that's how we survived. And if you're still alive, then, it must have worked. And so that perpetuates this vicious cycle of self-criticism, self-abuse that leads to further suffering. And so that's why inherently the mind is negative, because we're wired for survival and nothing ever, pleasant killed you. So it's like the negativity is inherent. And so one of the things that you experience in post-liberation is you experience the mind as completely a utility. It's no longer this sort of negative self-talk or negative there is none of that anymore. And the reason that is because it was never really a mind issue. It was a body, nervous system, emotional issue. And so that's why trying to solve it from the mind is like, if you're playing music and you decide to like drown it out with another speaker of music, you're just adding conditioning on top of the conditioning, rather than like tuning the station back to where its default setting is, which is the authentic self, which is outside of the conditioned responses that we feel will bring us love, right? Unconditional love is experienced once we unwind all of the conditioning.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like we all want to be happy, joyous, and free.
Yes. And that's the natural state. The reason we want to be that is that the natural state. Like, I don't have to try to be those things. I experience that intrinsically.
Right.
And so the biggest step towards healing is meeting yourself exactly where you are. Right. So, asking like, where do people start? Well, for one, like understand that you have to meet the painful parts within yourself. Right? Because those are the areas that need reconnection, and they need to be met with deep levels of intimacy and honesty and vulnerability and openness, because those are the things it didn't receive. That's why there's still pain there, is that there wasn't an ability to neurologically develop, and or there was actually direct pain inflicted on it because of patterns from the past that your parents survived from their parents and so forth. And so that emergent pattern has to be met with self-love, with compassion, with grace, with understanding, because that's all of the practices that will allow that to heal, right? Because if you try to use shame, blame, and guilt and fear, it'll just drive you back into the very thing that resulted in your need to escape it, which is distraction, addiction, some form of dissociation or coping that helped you escape the nature of the conditioned self, which includes the mind and all of the conditions of the nervous system, sensations and somatic that come as a result of that. So these things are very visceral, body-like. Largely people are operating reality from the mind. And that's why the majority of this is like trying to actually become embodied, meaning trying to experience reality from being in our body. And it's once we're in our body, everything makes sense. The reason exercise is so enjoyable for people is because they're in their body, right? Usually. Now you can use exercise to dissociate and to sort of like not be in the body. But ultimately, exercise is a powerful way of experiencing reality through the body, through increased levels of energy. And it actually feels enjoyable to be in the body once those endorphins and enkephalins are going. But healing work largely is about meeting the areas that are uncomfortable. And so it's going in the path of most resistance. And that's why most people don't heal, is because the nervous system that helped you survive, which is based on social survival, is the opposite of what will allow you to heal, because healing is about self-love. And we're not taught self-love. We're not wired for self-love. And ultimately, that is what the spiritual path is. And you're just loving your inner child, which is essentially the innocence of a child, which is represented as the divine.
Okay. Let's talk about the newbie.
Yeah, the newbie is something.
So the newbie is like my favorite thing.
Yes.
And I go in pretty much on a weekly basis. And I know that you can tell how I'm doing emotionally based upon working with me in the newbie. So tell people about the newbie. What is it and why does it work? How does it work?
Yeah. So the newbie is one of these powerful technologies that I would say is the biggest advancement and breakthrough in orthopedic medicine, and also which is body in terms of musculoskeletal, and then also in terms of performance. And so muscle building and the ability to access the nervous system through a stimulus. So the newbie uses a DC pulse current to mimic the same signal our nervous system sends, but it turns up the volume of that signal. So theoretically, we've said that it's about 250 times stronger than the signal we can send. And you could imagine, right, if you can turn up the volume of the signal that's running through us, when we do rehab exercises, at 250 times the strength of that signal, that's 4 repetitions equivalent to 1,000 neurological repetitions, right? So all of a sudden you're taking something and magnifying the same processes that we do know to be effective in a way that allows the body and nervous system to communicate and to connect in a way that allows it to improve at a much faster rate. So what we see, you can look up a lot of the literature and studies. If you go to NeuFit's website, there's actually been a lot more literature and research reinforcing this, but from a pure standpoint of just empirical data, it reduces rehabilitation time by about anywhere between 50 to 70%. And this is on average, this isn't like exceptional case studies. So if someone comes in with an ACL injury, normally it might take 9 months. Usually we see it, 4 to 5 months, sometimes a little sooner, sometimes a little later. It depends on the individual and the other variables. But ultimately, if you have any sort of post-op procedure, you could say that the rehabilitation time would be cut down by that magnitude. And the reason is because our nervous system's wired for survival, right? We've mentioned this a number of times in this podcast, but the way that is impacted in like an orthopedic injury, let's just say for the knee, we talked about the ACL, the immediacy of the nervous system is to shut down communication to that area because it's trying to survive, and it doesn't need all its parts to survive. And so what happens is a lot of neurological inhibition actually goes into that area, meaning neurological output to the muscle that would normally create strength output and stability of the knee is sort of downregulated. That's why if you see immediately, you can start to see atrophy. There's a certain neurological tone that would be normal there that actually reduces. That volume of neurological tone is neurological inhibition. And that's largely dictated through pain and trauma. And so the newbie is able to connect back there, help the brain and nervous system actually reconnect and help it understand that it's no longer in the state of trauma, right? So as it reconnects to that, it's able to start to relax those governors of neurological inhibition and turn back the volume so that the neurological output is closer to pre-injury and then eventually above that. And that's where performance comes, is we're able to loosen those governors that the nervous system normally would ratchet down because it's wired for survival. But if we create connection, we create safety. And the way we create connection is we basically turn up communication, right? And this is in all aspects of relationships. And the newbie just happens to be more orthopedic designed in terms of for the musculoskeletal system. And so a lot of the things I do in the clinic is largely around connection and communication and magnifying those signals within the nervous system to bring back online safety. And through safety, you experience healing because safety is the prerequisite for the parasympathetic nervous system. And it actually a result of the activity of the parasympathetic nervous system and the vagus nerve, which is 85% of the nervous system, and that turns down all of the inflammatory pathways in the body. So it's a very system-wide approach, but the newbie can be used for post-op rehabilitation, for pain, injury, also for performance. And so it's one of the broadest tools of intervention for the direct interaction of the nervous system in the fastest way possible that tilts more to that side, where acupuncture tilts more to broader systemic things in terms of like emotions, in terms of anxiety, depression, in terms of digestive issues, chronic illness. They both interact, but the difference is just the direction and the magnitude of where that is on the spectrum.
Okay. And those are the two main modalities that you use at your clinic, right?
Yeah. So I would say acupuncture, somatic work, which is in combination, which is craniosacral work, and the ability of Tui Na, which is Chinese medical massage. And then the newbie, both from exercise, performance, and then I'd use, certain massage tools, like if you experience the body buffer and then also things. And what I'm doing is trying to get you in the body. If I can get you in the body and we can start talking, you can start processing, right? That's why I'm not like the biggest fan of just talk therapy, because like talk therapy without integration of the body is still compartmentalized, and the body is what processes the past. Right. The mind is just kind of talking about it. That's why sometimes people will go through therapy. It'll help a little bit, but it's not fully integrating. It's because we need to take it to the bottom up approach, which again is the body, it's the nervous system, it's the emotions. So really I'm trying to bring it all together under one system rather than sort of compartmentalize everything. Like you need this. And I'm looking at the patient and understanding these patterns of where they're at internally and helping to shift them using these tools. Right. So most people are like, oh, I should go get acupuncture. I should go to this. They looking at it from a service-based thing. Yeah. They're not really understanding the nature of like when to apply it and how to create transformative shifts. And that's why it's called breakthrough performance rehab. It's helping you break through these experiences or blocks that you have within your nervous system from the past that are preventing you from being present in your body, which will allow you to perform at your highest level.
Right. Yeah, it's funny. I see you on a weekly basis, and I tell people about you, and they're like, "Well, what is it?" And it's like, well, I work out with the newbie, but it's not really it's a workout. I get a workout, but there's way more to it. It's emotional, it's spiritual, it's talk therapy. It's like all of those things. So it's much more than a workout. It's much more than any of those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the opposite of specialized medicine, right? So specialized medicine is like almost everyone experiences nowadays. They go to their primary care and they get basically referred out, and then you get referred out again and referred out again. And it's because no one's looking at the whole anymore. No one's even practicing the whole anymore. And so when you come into my clinic, people are always asking like, well, what does he do? Because they're looking at things from the same way that we've been conditioned to, which is essentially through specialization. And specialization is only effective in surgery or acute infectious disease or in like life-saving emergency medicine. Outside of that, a lot of it needs to be integrated in the whole, because again, healing is derived from the word wholeness. In order to shift the system, we sort of need to be working at all systems at once so we can pull the lever that helps the breakthrough in terms of their patterns and shifts them to an entirely different state, right? And so this sort of reductionist view of things is the challenge, is because everyone's looking at the outputs, and the way my clinic largely works is the inputs, and those inputs are pulling those levers and using those tools in whichever way to help support the person actually start to create a sense of trust within themselves and understand self-love, and also understand why they are doing the things that they're doing. Like most of the time people have these adaptations that we've all pathologized, and they think that like ultimately they're a bad person as a result of that. I'm sure you get this all the time. And the people who are like, I'm addicted, I'm horrible, I feel like I can't do anything right. Little do they know that a lot of these things were compensations from their early development. They didn't have a sense of safety and emotional attunement from their mother and their father, which also didn't have from their mother and father. And so that pattern caused them to try to find safety in their own body inside through these compensations. Drugs are just an attempt to feel connected without the pain and chaos of a dysregulated nervous system.
Right. It's the solution.
Yes.
It's the solution to the pain.
Exactly. And so, I think if anything, it should be a representation of how these people need more love, more compassion, and more care, right? But the reason we have so much stigma and issues with it is we're wired for social survival, and areas of addiction, drugs, sex, these are things that are in the shadow that are the most impactful, but the way they've been sort of dealt with in social constructs is basically through shame, blame, and guilt, right? But ultimately, these things are where all of our power lie in terms of our energy of our system. And so what we need to do is bring it to the light and help us see why these things are occurring, why these really strong forces are causing compensations and deviations from what would normally be healthy. And if we can do that, then we can actually allow that release of tension to come back to the center. Otherwise, you're creating this, again, perpetuating cycle of like, I'm bad. And then that leads me to use the solution again, right?
It's the guilt and the shame.
Yes, the whole vicious cycle.
Let's talk about the inaccurate body. So you've talked about the myth of the inaccurate body. What does that mean?
Yeah. So the primary approach from Western biomedicine is that we look at the body as broken, and we largely look at it as like a machine. And then you look at okay, well, how do we fix these broken parts, and how do we fix these broken outputs? Whereas from a Eastern and sort of ancient wisdom is that we look at the body as accurate, and it's communicating all of these outputs because of how experience has shaped it, right? And that intelligently it's learned how to survive through those compensations. And so we actually are listening to it and trying to understand why it arrived at the compensation adaptation that it did, and how we can unwind back to its original state before those things occurred, and in fact, more resilient, right? So all wisdom, clarity, and discernment are a result of processed emotions, right? So when you're in emotional state and you're very confused and you're very wounded, you're like, I don't know what to do. If you sit with the emotions long enough, or days elapse and you process enough, you're like, oh, I'm clear now. It's because discernment, clarity, and wisdom are a result of processed emotions. They are the very conduit. So not only are we taking this sort of organism that's adapted in these really stressful conditions in a very effective way, but we're helping them integrate back into the whole, and then have the wisdom and resilience and clarity of how to navigate forward, not from a survival standpoint of hypervigilance or neuroticism, but from a place of safety because of the healing. And so that is the biggest difference, is that people actually think that the body is this some, mechanical problem. And then really it's this innate intelligent organism that's adapting to all unhealthy scenarios that kept you alive. Like in my situation, like obviously I realized like it was super unhealthy.
Right.
And my body was communicating. It was telling me the truth. I thought it was my body was the problem, but that is what shame is. Shame is an inherent ability to try to help you survive. You think that the people that have the resources, which your parents or people around you that raised you, they have to be God basically to you, because if your mind doesn't perceive it that way, it may lose access to those resources. So that's why we think inherently, how many times you hear, well, my parents were the best. Everyone, it's not that they weren't doing their best. It's just they, like all of us, have compensation adaptations. And so they were only able to be as connected with you as they were connected with their parents and themselves. And so that leaves a lot of compensations because we didn't have that emotional attunement that would allow for a super healthy and robust nervous system to develop a sense of safety within themselves. And those early years are the most impactful. And so really, it's looking at the body as innate and intelligent, not broken. And that is why it's a myth to think that ultimately that the body is inaccurate. It's actually accurate. And I know that now because I experienced the opposite. Like my genetics didn't change, but my epigenetics and my conditioned self changed. And that was because I unwound all of the conditioned self, the unprocessed emotions. I healed the trauma, and I rebuilt the body through biochemistry and nutrition and all of the circadian rhythm regulation, the lifestyle, and relationships, right? So all those things, I didn't know how to have healthy relationships because that wasn't mirrored to me. I thought people were threats, people to be avoided. And ultimately that is what helps us actually feel healthy, is connection. And so all of these things had to be built from the ground up. And that's part of what led me down this whole path, was that when you go from one end of the extreme and not having any of it, and the only way out is back through, you have to sort of figure it all out. And I was just devoted to doing that process. And I think ultimately it was to understand the entire human experience and the full spectrum of both, I would say, what most people experience is a sense of deep suffering in hell and disconnection, to all the way to experience of safety in heaven, which is full connection and feeling a sense of expansion, meaning receptivity to whatever that's coming at you is okay because you feel safe within your own body. And that's really where home is in our own body.
Right. It's like life is happening for me, not to me.
Yes.
And it's just, it's like, it's not, I also think about it's not a big deal. And I think I shared that with you. A friend of mine, my old sponsor, Todd, remember I sat with him and he said, cause his son had committed suicide a couple years prior. And he realized that most things that people think are a big deal are just not a big deal. And I kind of adopted that mindset, and I'm like, okay, how did that change my conditioning? How did that change the way that I was domesticated? Yep. Because I used to think that everything was a big deal, and it's the end of the world. I'm going to lose everything. I'm going to lose my business. I'm going to lose my house. I'm going to lose this relationship, and all. It's like the house is on fire. And I just I just realized that, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where I live. Doesn't matter if I live in this big, beautiful house or if I live in this 1-bedroom apartment. Yes. Doesn't matter if I'm in business or if I'm not in business. You know, I can be in this relationship or that. I mean, it's like, you know, all these things happen in life, and just learning that, you know, it's going to be okay.
Yes.
It's always going to be okay.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I think that was probably a process for me, and I know it was a process for you as well.
Yes. Yeah. And I think, you know, you give great, tremendous insight from that framework of perspective,
right?
Because that's ultimately something that you probably arrived at both directly, experientially, through the nature of just life experience, right? You went through a lot of different eras where you felt like you needed that to feel safe, right? And this is sort of the two things we sort of as humans sort of cling to. It's either we have attachments or avoidances, right? And so those attachments we cling on to because we think they're bringing us a sense of safety. And largely those attachments are based on social conditioning that we've gravitated to as like a way of feeling like a sense of belonging or a sense of like validation or acknowledgement. And that can happen, you know, with achievements, or it can anything external, right? And so that gives us a transient experience of safety because we're like, oh, well, we belong now, right? But ultimately it's transient because it's not actually coming from a place of self-love, right? Remember, social survival, self-love. And so ultimately, what you're really longing for is an experience of eternal safety within your own body. In order to do that, we have to practice self-love. And through that, we start to experience that, oh, things aren't that big a deal, because anything outside of us is essentially always going to be shift shaping. That's the nature of reality. It's a constant state of change. And the areas where we feel like panicked and urgent are just things from the past of not feeling safe, connected, and loved. And so when you're experiencing that conditioning, it can be a really strong pattern to break. And one of the things I remember, even a little bit into my clinic early on, I had kind of like built this entire way of living. I wanted to sort of build it so it was the architecture was as most aligned as possible. And I could still sense that like there was something so urgent within me. Like I was still trying to get somewhere. And I think most people can experience this where you feel like you're always on this state of urgency is always from a state of trauma. So if you have places where you feel urgent, it's coming from within the nature of unprocessed things from the past. And so that was my last kind of thing. I'm like, I built everything architecturally in my life to be exactly in alignment with me. And I was still having this sense of urgency. And this was when I got to my final layers of healing. And that was where I, you know, had my last 2 years of healing were quite exponential in terms of my shift of my physiology, my psychology, my neurology, my biology. And I saw glimpses of that along the path, but they never were consistent. I would go through these like huge ups and downs and felt like I was going back into my trauma, and then I'd be back out above water, and then I'd go back under. And then eventually there was a permanent shift, and you have this experience of just eternal safety. And you realize that like, oh, it was all conditioned. The conditioned self was experiencing reality. And as it was changing, some part of that self was experiencing either panic or urgency or emotional elation and excitement because I thought it was getting somewhere. But ultimately what you come down to is complete safety once the conditioned self has been completely dissolved into the authentic self, which is the true self that we all are underneath the conditioned self. And that's just a state of eternal safety and love and connection and clarity. And so that is, you know, what you speak to on that point is like a perspective shift in the mind that can help people start to kind of get there. And then the next layer would be kind of like inquiring into like, where am I like still experiencing that conditioning in my life, you know, because the greatest level of performance is actually from a place of the flow state. And the flow state is complete relaxation internally and a sense of safety, right? And so it's the ability to let go. And so that sense is something that we can learn to experience all the time through the nature of this work and this healing.
Right. You know, I'm thinking about, so 90% of transformation is awareness. And so it's like, we've got to change in our body, and we've got to process these, the whatever traumas from the past. And I'm just thinking about, okay, the mind. So if I know it, if I'm aware, maybe is that the first place to go? Do you need to be aware of it first before you can process the trauma, or what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, you always have to have awareness of this before you can go anywhere else, because if you're not aware, then ultimately you can't actually start the processing. And awareness, and particularly awareness in the body. So there's a distinction here that I think that maybe would be helpful for people, is like, if you're driving in your vehicle and you're going home, and all of a sudden, like, you realize, like, oh, how did I get home? Like, I was dreaming in my mind about
right.
something, but of course, like, the autopilot of us like drove home. That would be a representation of the dreaming mind, where you were kind of like had the awareness of what you were thinking in the mind, but that really had no relationship to the body. And healing is about taking that attention awareness and directing it to the body, the sensations, the patterns, the neurological holdings, the breathing patterns, what's going on. It's what we would consider scientifically as interoception or interoceptive awareness, which is awareness within the sensations of the body. And I really say that spirituality is really the objectivity of the internal state. So it's taking your attention and awareness that normally you would be focused outwardly, and you focus it inwardly. And the crazy part of it is it's pretty much like physics done internally.
Okay.
It's like you bring an observer into a physics experiment, it starts to change the experiment, right? And so pretty much the whole meditative process and this sort of attention awareness that's brought to the self that creates the transformation is just a state of connection and awareness to what is already happening. And the paradox of the universe is that that is what creates the transformation, not you trying to reject or resist what's going on. It's just coming closer to the body itself that's experiencing those sensations and those experiences within itself as a result of the stimuli outside. Right. And so that meditation helps create a broader gap, because otherwise you jump into the mind, because over the body is essentially a microcosm of the entire universe. And that's why it's so overwhelming. That's the reason the conditioned self exists anyways, is it's too much stimuli for us to handle and process all at once. So we have a conditioned self, we filter reality all through that. That's why people are having such vastly different experiences of reality, is because they're filtering it through their past in the present. And if you want to experience reality in a way that is what most people would consider the liberated state or a healed state, is essentially we have to go in and through the body. And the way to do that is to take the attention and awareness and direct it within the body. So maybe you're aware mentally, like, I have this addictive pattern, or I have this pattern of relationship where I'm constantly arguing with my significant other. Like, I'm aware of it. The next thing to do is to be aware of the body when you're in those situations, because that's the layer of the bottom up approach that I'm speaking to that most people are missing, is they kind of know what's happening at the layer of the mind, but they're not actually present in the body to create the transformative nature of experience, because all healing is experiential, and people think that healing can be, intellectual, and there can be portions of it that's helpful, but it's largely experiential in the same way trauma was experiential. And so the only way to experience something new is to be in the experience. And that's why you have to come back to the body. And when you come back to the body, it's like, okay, I'm having this argument. Like, what am I feeling in my body? Most people aren't aware because they're in their mind. And especially when that intensity of argument starts to happen, it shoots you out of the body into the mind.
Right.
And so all of healing is coming back to embodiment, but it's a process, because if it were to all happen at once, ultimately, theoretically, it could happen because we're all whole underneath. But for the body and nervous system, it's a real physiological and neurological change. This is all very somatic. It isn't something theoretical. It's all directly verifiable within. Some of the experiences that I had along the path felt like I was dying. Like literally dying. And it was nothing to do with anything in terms of like biomedical parameters that would show up, but they were the neurological experiences as if they were happening. And people can, experience that in panic attacks or anything that is directly experiential. There's nothing biomedically wrong with you, but the nervous system gives way to as if you're experiencing that just as significant as if it was actually biomedically wrong with you. Right. And so, yeah.
So you mentioned meditating. You're a huge meditator. How important is it for someone to meditate?
it's sort of the gateway into all of what we're talking about, because if you can't be really present with your attention awareness when there's very little stimuli, it's very hard to do it when you're in the game of reality, where there's so much coming at you at once. Right. So it sort of gives you the foundation necessary to move further out. It's very necessary in the beginning. And if you really want to accelerate along your healing path, I would say like ultimately it's exceptionally necessary. The reason is because when you meditate, meditation is really just silent sitting, bringing your attention awareness to the body and the breath. And every time it gets caught up in the mind and story and narrative, you bring it back to the body and the breath, because all of the past can only be processed in the present, and the body and breath are the only things that are always present. And so meditation is this practice. And so it's like in the same way that if you wanted to play in the NBA, you'd have to practice before you played in the NBA. And meditation is a way to practice this process that we're talking about before you jump into the nature of like your triggers, your reactions, your patterns, so that you have actually an opportunity to come back there. Otherwise, like, I mean, it could happen, but it's very unlikely that most people can stay within their body within really intense situations, you know, especially in like, you'll see in significant events happen where people are like, I don't know how I did that. They either freeze, they fawn, they fight, like they're completely dissociated. The overwhelm of the primitive side has overtaken them, and they've shot themselves into the mind, and they're completely unconscious in terms of what their behavior is. So that would be like the highest level of like overwhelm. But ultimately we sort of like vary that depending on your lifestyle and your patterns.
So courageous conversations and emotional honesty. Why are emotionally honest conversations so central to healing?
So the reason they're so central to healing is that wherever we have a difficult time with our conversations, and particularly the person that we have a difficult time with, is where we are emotionally and neurologically blocked and underdeveloped. So, you know, for instance, talking about anything is a form of expression and expansion and processing. So it's very helpful. But ultimately, like if you want to connect to the places that you're disconnected from, then you have to follow the path of fear, which requires courage. And so like, oh, I'm afraid to have this conversation with my mom or my dad or my brother or my sister or the person that abused me. Those things are the areas where you are neurologically and emotionally blocked. And that's where the greatest level of healing is. I always say, well, everything we want, everything we avoid is in the same place. And this is a very strong representation of that. You know, in my own healing, it took a lot of courage to bring all of my family together and, you know, discuss about the sexual abuse and trauma that took place. But all my other siblings were going to go to the grave with it. And so the nervous system and the brain are holding on to all of that. That's a large degree of energy going towards suppression, which can be freed up for healing. And so that is why it's so important. Like, and it feels like if you talk or you connect with someone that you really don't want to, it feels like almost like a weight's lifted off you. You feel a little bit lighter. That's largely because your nervous system is carrying that.
Right.
And you're so normalized to it because once you carry something for a while, it's like shoes you wear, a watch you wear, you don't even notice you're wearing it. It's like a part of your sensory experience. It normalizes into it. And so most people's nervous systems aren't aware of how much they're carrying from the past. And this is where I would say like the ultimate level of integration is having the courageous and honest conversations. Because if you just try to process within yourself without reconnecting and having those conversations, it's probably not going to be the complete process. And it's one of the reasons people will say, well, like, I don't want to do that is because like it's contingent on how the person might react, or they will completely do what created the wound to begin with, which is like discredit them or not acknowledge them or validate that actually happened. That's not what healing is. Healing is about the expression of your truth of what happened within you, not that someone else validates it. And so your ability to express that truth is the ability for you to reconnect to that part of you that became disconnected as a result of that stimuli, right? That person, that situation, that circumstance. And by having that courageous conversation, you're giving your inner child the ability to experience safety. It's like a little child gets in some sort of fight or whatever, and he doesn't know how to go to the other child, the parent, or maybe the teacher, whatever, be like, bring the other kid here. Let's have a conversation. Like there's a reason for that. right? In the same way, there's a reason why our own inner child is screaming for us to express our truth of experience of what happened, why it happened to the person that either harmed us or to the nature of like the difficulty of disconnection that resulted from certain agreements being broken within the relationship or things being done that were unhealthy. And so fundamentally, we, again, don't understand that this is all connected. And that healing, there's nothing separate, but that is one of the most important things that I would say get the least amount of emphasis. And it's largely because of social constructs. You know, they don't, for me to bring that to my family, like the repercussions is like, oh, the family's not going to be split apart. They're going to go apart. But self-love is different than social survival. And most of the time, once we're 18 and above, we're operating off of the social conditioning of survival that no longer is needed. But it's what keeps us in this experience of feeling like we're not free. Mm-hmm. And that's why a lot of us long for financial liberation. We think it'll bring freedom, but we're really longing for internal freedom, freedom from suffering. And that's path is really around these things, which is dealing with the past, because the present has no suffering. It's only if the past is unprocessed that the present has suffering.
Right. I think as we're talking about this, I think of Joe Polish always mentions Dave Kekich credos. Life is easy if you live it the hard way, and hard if you live it the easy way.
It's very accurate.
And I think about hard conversations. Anytime I don't want to have a conversation, it's I know I got it, and I'm much better today than I was, years ago. I've continued to get better. But there's still conversations that if I don't want to have the conversation, it's like, why don't I want to have that conversation?
Yes.
I always feel better on the other side of the conversation.
Yes.
Always, 100% of the time.
Yeah, it's exactly like the cold plunge. That's the analogy I always use is
right.
like, having a hard conversation is kind of like the cold plunge. You don't really want to go in, but if you go in, you always feel better afterwards.
Always, 100% of the time.
Yeah. So it's like, I think that there are certain things that we have to learn to just lean into. And this is one of those things that I would say is vastly important to our healing and wholeness that is very underappreciated and not really discussed. It was a practice I started when I was 19, when I became mute from the severity of the depression. I realized how important communication was and the ability to have your own voice and to speak it and to have clarity. And the way that worked was me going to all of the relationships that I experienced either pain from or that I felt like I created pain for and asking for forgiveness and also, communicating what I felt like was true. Was it always true? Not necessarily, but it was true for me in my experience. And that actually unburdened so much that I was carrying. And that is really the key with all of these things, right? Is to let go of the things that we're still holding on to that are keeping us in this state of suffering.
That's it. What happens when people avoid these difficult conversations?
Yeah, what happens is essentially
we kind of already touched on this.
Totally. Yeah. It's largely around avoidance, right? Depression, the resulting nature of disconnection from the things that maybe we want to be connected with, right? In the same way, if you have a painful ankle, you don't want to connect with the pain, but ultimately you want to connect with the function of what that ankle does. And a lot of that is the relationships. If you have these areas where you're not having these conversations, the relationship doesn't work the way it does when you're connected, right? So these communications are what allow that to heal and reconnect and a sense of safety to be acclimated to both sides.
So exercise addiction versus exercise addiction as avoidance. So if you said exercise addiction is often socially rewarded, can you explain that?
So a lot of exercise is like predominantly focalized on the nature of like the body and or achievement or goals or records or whatever. So it's like, how does my body look? How does my body perform in terms of the goals or things like that? So it's largely dictated around external validation. And from a social construct standpoint, like you can see that, like we look at things from more of this sort of understanding of like, okay, I have a program in front of me. I've got to hit the program. But we almost do it to the exclusion of our own body's communication, which is like the opposite of what exercise really is at the healthiest expression of, because it'd be like me, looking at Google Maps and it's like, it doesn't show a boulder. And so I'm like, oh, well, there's a boulder in front of me. I'm just going to go straight to it, and go hit the boulder. But that's what we do with our exercise programs. Like, oh, I'm hurting here, I'm hurting there. And it's like, that's the direct experience. It would be like the road seeing the boulder,
Right.
but then we like latch on, no, the program says this, as if the program is superior to our direct experience, and abdicating that power away is part of the pathology. And really, it's supposed to be a loose guide to help us understand the dynamic processes of connection with the body. Really, every time you exercise, you get an opportunity to sense in a deeper, richer way what's going on, right? You're like, oh, this is hurting, that's hurting, or like, this is feeling really good. I feel really great. I feel more resilient. I feel stronger. And so that ability to stay connected in a highly engaged way of exercise is more of an exploratory process, an experiential process, rather than this one that focuses on outcomes and goals and achievements. And look, I'm someone who utilizes those things in my earlier fitness years, and they were greatly beneficial. But I think that it's gotten so extreme into the social validation side that this is why you have body dysmorphia. This is why you have people who are ultimately abusing their bodies instead of actually connecting with their bodies. And so I do see like a lot of pathology in exercise, more so than I think is necessary. And it's largely dictated on these social aspects of our survival, which isn't wrong. But I think if people have a different relationship, like I still deadlift today, I still work out, I still like progress, you know, in a way that allows me to stay at a very high level performance. And people have this idea that the mind somehow drives greater performance. I would say that it can in the short term, sometimes, like a cattle prong, you know, you can really drive cows in a certain direction. But in the long term, they contract, they avoid, they're fearful. And the same way our body is that same way. Like you can force it in the short term to do really strong feats, but in the long term, it's ultimately going to be distrustful, and it's going to start communicating in that way. And so the idea is to hold that with a sense of like fluidity and not rigidity. So it's like, okay, you have these goals and you have like these parameters you want to hit, but let's not ignore the direct experience of the body, right? If it's communicating like I need a rest day or I need to take off, like, and it's not in the program, take it off.
Right.
Like that's listening and not trying to just dictate through the mind or the program that we've laid out, because these things are not perfect. They can't account for all the variables that are happening within the human experience.
Is there a single root cause of illness, or is health more like a web of influences?
Yeah. So I would say that most of the conversation is this idea that we will get to a root cause of something. Even in functional medicine, they always like kind of preach like, oh, let's get to the root cause. And ultimately going back to the complex systems is really, it's more of a web of effects that are happening, and they're happening at different layers. So at the molecular level, at the cellular level, at the organ level, at the layer of psychology, at the layer of environment, all of these layers are communicating all at once. At the layer of hormones, right? If your hormones are communicating, it's affecting all those other layers. It's a misunderstanding, right? It's again, going back to the nature of looking at the appropriate models, and complex systems models are far more accurate in the nature of how our biology and physiology, neurology, and mental health and emotional health all work together. And it depends on what layer and what leverage point that you need to pull to affect the whole system, right? If you go through a breakup, right, or you lose a loved one, that emotional, spiritual can affect the entire physical realm, right? The cellular level. And for me, I could be like, okay, well, we need to really dial in your physical stuff, but that wouldn't be the right lever to pull. The right lever to pull right there would be getting you to be able to emotionally process the pain and wounding from experiencing separation from the loved one or the relationship, and help to actually reconnect to those parts of yourself that have that emotional pain. And that would be the highest lever to pull. And that will affect your physical health. That'll affect your mental, emotional, spiritual health, and all of the systems on the cellular level, on the organ level, and so forth. So it's really a web of effects. And this is why like reductionist medicine or single causative effects, it's not that it can't be a model to be used. Right. It's just not the most accurate model, because it doesn't encompass most accurately the complexity of our system, which is not able to be reduced to some single variable.
Well, it's not really getting to the root cause. It's just like it's very surface level. And I think that's usually the approach, is like surface level. Like, this is the issue, let's try to fix it.
Yeah, it's kind of like in a pinball machine. You know, they're trying to react to what is coming out in terms of the output, not actually understanding the dynamics of the relationship of the interworkings of what's creating that dysfunction in terms of the output. And so if we understand the interdependence and the relationships that are going on within the system and how to support that from functioning, the output will change as a result of actually correcting that.
Right. So what models do you find most accurate in helping people navigate back to wholeness?
Yeah, the most accurate models would be from an individual standpoint, would be looking at like Ayurvedic medicine and looking at your constitution and then matching that up with, some of your diet, your lifestyle, your circadian rhythm, and then your emotional tendencies as a deep level of insight into the self. The nature of models such as complex systems and Chinese medicine and functional medicine are a greater aspect of understanding how to navigate towards wholeness. On the emotional side, there is internal family systems. That model actually helps us understand that there are no bad parts and essentially allows us to reconnect and unwind the protective parts. And then the parts that are actually in exile, as they call them, and connect to the deeply wounded parts. And as we do, they lose their emotional charge and they actually come back to the nature of where they were at their original experience, but with wisdom and clarity and discernment. And so those are probably the most broad and most common. There are other models. The most common model that I use on the emotional side, which you actually use, I know a lot within your clinic, is the 4 agreements, the 5 agreements. That model is more of a functioning model of how to navigate the nature of reality in the most truest form that helps you unwind the conditioned self, right? When you're trying to not take things personal, all you're trying to do is like essentially realize that the triggers within you are within your direct power to heal those wounds so that the detonators, which are the people, the circumstances that trigger you, will eventually dissolve away. And then you'll experience that there was nothing personal. Like for me, like I don't have a trigger in 3 years. So it's like, of course I know now that's absolutely 100% true.
Right.
Even though at 19, when I was triggered by everything, everyone, I thought there's no way that's true, you know?
Right.
So it's like, it's true how many wounds within the nervous system of these things are we carrying. Those are the landmines that people outside can detonate.
Right.
Right. And so that becomes a functioning model of always do your best, right? The always doing your best is essentially that your day-to-day, based on all these factors of complexities that we've talked about, can change. And not judging it off of some idealistic standard that you had when you were at your best functioning, and then using that criticism to judge yourself. Right. So those are just 2 of the agreements. We won't go into each and every other one, but those are part of the encompassing model of reality that can help you navigate the emotional aspects while staying true to you, because a lot of healing is really about your expression of truth and your connection back to wholeness through self-love.
Right. I love the 4 agreements. It's just like feeling good about my behavior, doing the next right thing, being a good person, not taking things personally. That took me a long time. And over the years, I've just gotten so much better at it. And it's like, it doesn't matter what another person does. It doesn't have anything to do with me.
Yes.
It's like a person, whether it's someone that I'm having a disagreement with, a family member, someone I had a falling out with, someone who did something to me many, many, many years ago. And it's like, it doesn't have anything to do with me. And then when I see them, and I know there was a guy that I had a disagreement with back in 2014. I remember it specifically. And it took me many years, and I would see him, I'd see him at meetings. And when I'd see him at a meeting, I used to be pretty triggered by him. Yeah. But then as time went on, and I think I continued my healing and I continued my work, I finally got to a point where I saw him and there was just no energy. And it's just, and that's liberation. That's the freedom and the liberation. It's okay. Like he's going to do what he's going to do. I don't have to agree with his decisions. It's totally fine though. It's not a big deal.
Yes. And that's where my definition of love is accepting all things exactly as it is, just the way it is. And what that means experientially in the body is non-resistance to all expressions, all things. Right. And that's the only way we can be in our truth, if we allow all expressions from others to be okay. Otherwise, we're in reactivity to their expression, and thus we're in their truth, right? So it's like, that's a process, right? Where we learn to relax and receive reality exactly as it is. But that is where we experience love.
Right. And I think of step one, I'm powerless, and I'm powerless over people, places, and things. And so, like, I'm not in control. I'm not God. I'm not the universe. I'm not the higher power.
Yes.
I'm just Tim.
Yes.
And I don't get to play the puppet
Shift
master.
shaper. Yeah.
Exactly. Do you believe unresolved trauma is the most overlooked driver of disease?
Yes. And I think largely from my own experience of this, is from direct experience, but then also clinically working with this. The reason that no one wants to deal with trauma is because it's sort of messy from a social construct standpoint. And so it's just easier to medicate away the symptoms or the signs rather than deal with the actual trauma itself. And trauma is what happens within us, not what happens to us, as Dr. Gabor Mate eloquently communicates. With that, the changes are the patterns that we're talking about today that can be better mapped through Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, through complex systems, so that we can understand how do we adapt through this compensation. And so, it's trauma is the conduit to the nature of the conditioned self that becomes the negative expressions of epigenetics. And they're negative from the standpoint of, like, the results are quite inflammatory, they're quite problematic, that lead to autoimmune disease and other physical symptoms, which was validated and credited in the largest study done on adverse childhood events. Back in the 80s, they essentially did the largest study that looked at what trauma did to the physical body. And there was like a 3 times more likelihood of heart disease, 4 times more likely increase in autoimmune disease, and 8 times more likely increase in depression, and a 12 times more likelihood in suicide. And there's all sorts of other things that I'm not mentioning. And so what people don't realize is that the trauma affects our biology today. And so most of traditional medicine isn't have the models or the systems to really account for that. And because healing is experiential and most of Western medicine is transactional, we're not getting there, right? And so that's the biggest challenge, is that we have to have something that can hold experiential medicine, which allows the person to have a new experience within themselves so that they can process the trauma. And that's why a lot of my practice is body-based in terms of the modalities and therapies, because I'm trying to help them shift the experience within, not only the patterns of the past that were compensations from trauma, but also unwind patterns that may be just unhealthy from their conditioned state, from their parents, learning from their parents, and so forth. And what are the healthy ways of engaging with nature, because we're an extension of nature, that would allow us to thrive.
So what does it actually look like when someone integrates trauma and they start to heal?
Yeah, it looks like expansion, safety, clarity, connection, and an understanding of why life is fun, why it's enjoyable, why it's joyful. I think, when we live in the mind and we have trauma in the body, it seems like this is just, there's no point to any of this. And so it's the ability to reconnect with the vitality of life and energy, and the ability to feel fully alive. I think that we're all longing for that experience, is to feel fully alive and vibrant and connected. And so when we're able to unwind the areas of trauma and allow for that integration, not only does it create that experience within, but it also gives way to a tremendous level of discernment and wisdom and clarity, rather than reactivity and sort of hypervigilance and neuroticism that most people experience from the survival mode of unprocessed trauma. And that's why they're constantly trying to figure out how to fix reality or the things coming at them, because they're not trying to have that touch their pain. The liberating side is to heal the pain, integrate that, and then to arrive at a place of safety of experience that allows all of those qualities to be the natural state of qualities that we all enjoy, and to have that wisdom and clarity and discernment.
Right. For someone that's listening right now, what's one small practice they can start today to reconnect to their body?
I would say the number one thing is to bring your attention and awareness into the nature of the breath or the sensations of your body in terms of your sit bones or the sensation at the bottom of your feet. And that practice is something that you can do at any point, any time. Right? It doesn't mean you have to be in a state of meditation. And I think that most people think that if the world was perfect, meaning like it was completely like what they thought from ideological standpoint, that they would experience safety within. And yet we know that to be not the case, right?
If things were different than they are.
Yeah. Well, because
if
like
you're different than you are.
Yeah. Well, if you know, it's like people are always longing for like world peace and this idea of like, but we know that if we stick you in a 10-day retreat in Vipassana, which like would be like you're completely safe in this locked room that's completely dark, you would likely go crazy. And the reason you would is because you would have so much conditioning coming up. And this is like trying to prove the point that people who are trying to fix the world don't understand that even if the world was exactly the way they wanted, they would still suffer because the suffering isn't coming from outside of them. It's coming from within themselves. The ability to sit with themselves is actually the hardest thing to do. And so not only is it bringing sensations, but create spaciousness in their life so that they can just bring your attention and awareness back to the body and the breath. I would say healing is one of the more simple things. It's just really not easy, you know? And so I think I had the most difficult time understanding that it could be so simple. And that's when I started really down like even the deeper levels of meditation, doing 18 hours a week of meditation for over 2 years in order to really understand the nature of like this whole phenomenology that's happening within ourselves when we start to sit without the conditions or the sensations coming in from the outside. That's why spaciousness and stillness is necessary for healing so that you don't have more inputs coming in. And that means you can actually process. It's like everything we come from the external needs to be digested and processed. And we have a current day and age where we have so much stimuli coming in, a bombardment, but no one's actually have any space in their life to process any of it. So that's what ADHD, ADD, all those things, I experienced all of that. Before I ever healed, like all of those symptoms were very things that I experienced day to day that I don't experience any of anymore. And it's largely because meditation, and especially long bouts of meditation, completely rewire the brain, the nervous system. And so, you know, I would have loved to take a MRI of my brain and nervous system at 19. And now like it's entirely different. And it would have to be because my experience of reality is completely a 180.
Did you meditate this morning?
Yes, meditated this morning.
For how long?
This morning was just 30 minutes. Usually, you know, it depends on the day. When I had the large shift into sort of liberated state, it's a little bit interesting because meditation is normally something that you come back to the body, but my experience of reality is never in the dreaming mind anymore. There is no dreaming mind. So all I experience is the present moment. And so meditation was always designed to practice presence. And it was always something that as we got back to presence and it became an operating system that we didn't necessarily have to click an app, but we all have to use that app until it becomes the operating system. And so the reason long sits are so important is because the longer you sit, the more conditioning comes up, the deeper the layers. When you feel like you should get up and you're like, I can't sit here for a second longer, it's kind of like doing the 10th rep on a set in the gym when like the burn is kicking in or you're about to, that's where the adaptation is. And most people don't realize that like all meditation and like these internal spiritual practices are very physiological, biological, neurological, transformatively in terms of they're transformational in their ability to require adaptation. So when you're sitting with yourself in meditation, it's ultimately creating that.
Right.
And so when you get to that threshold where you feel like your conditioned self's trying to make you stand up to go do something or engage with your phone or engage, that's where the conditioning is getting released. And I always say like, how do you know when is when you can do either or and it doesn't matter.
Okay. Gotcha.
So when you feel like you can sit there for 3 hours and you don't have any of your conditioned self coming to like pull you in a direction or you have to go do this or do that. Yeah. You've hit a different threshold.
You've made it. Are your meditations always quiet?
When you say quiet, there's definitely can be noise from the outside.
I'm talking like music
LED.
or guided or anything like that.
So I think it would be powerful if the audience is like interested in meditation to really understand a framework of what meditation is from this standpoint of using a spectrum. So there's really two types of meditation on two different ends of the spectrum, and then everything in between lies on the spectrum. So there's basically contractionary meditation and expansionary meditation. And this model helps you understand the different types of meditation. So contractionary meditation is the ability to focus your attention on some single point. And so this might be your breath, some point in your body, or in some practices, they'll do a mantra. You have to be able to focus your attention to do anything. So this is always where people start in meditation, is the contractionary form of meditation. And Vipassana is a form of contractionary meditation. So that's basically body scanning. So you start at the top of your head and you're trying to sense the sensations, and then you go through your whole body into the bottoms of your feet. And you might use 5 minutes or so, or actually, 5 to 10 seconds or 15 seconds on a specific area, and then move to the next area and move to the next area. And so once you train your attention and awareness to be able to do that, you then are able to start to move down the spectrum of expansionary meditation. And expansionary meditation is the ability where your attention expands to awareness, meaning if I were to have you focus on the nature of the sound of your refrigerator at the exclusion of everything else, you could do that and it would be an immersive component. Or your work, right? You might focus so much to kind of like everything else, or you're thinking about something, everything immersive. That's like so extreme focus and attention. Expansionary meditation is to relax that attention into the awareness, meaning take everything in evenly. And you can practice this walking. Most of the time, like Sam Harris speaks about this, is do nothing meditation. So that framework of pure expansionary meditation is you're walking, and instead of focusing on any one thing, you focus on relaxing your vision by basically looking and taking in the peripheral, and you just allow all the sensations to be even in your experience. You're not contracted around one part of the experience. And this actually, we know, increases parasympathetic tone and relaxation. And the ultimate nature of the final experience is expansionary meditation. Some people will get so caught in contractionary meditation that they think there's a separate doer of the meditator. And that actually is part of what prevents some people moving into the final transition stage of liberation, is that there's some doer that's still conditioned to be a good meditator. And that's a tricky phase, right? Because like ultimately the person that arrived somewhere isn't the person that can walk through the next door. And so every stage of the sort of internal transformative path requires you to sort of like die of the way that you got there. So a lot of times people will be very used to applying a lot of effort. So it's hard for them to go to effortlessness. Right. And that was definitely the case for me. It was definitely very tricky. So in the beginning, contractionary meditation is best practiced through guided meditation. So like having someone help you guide, because the mind's so distracted, it's better to like listen to someone guide you. Otherwise you're just distracted. Then the next layer would be to kind of like focus that on yourself, doing Vipassana, body scanning, things like that. And then the next layer would be kind of like focusing on the sensations within your body. Once you were proficient enough in that area, you can start to incorporate do nothing meditation. The point where this becomes not helpful anymore is essentially when your mind is not as chaotic as it is in the beginning stages. And you'll kind of get a sense of that once you've done like a lot of meditation. If someone were to really be accelerating on this path they really want, I would recommend that everyone do like 1,000 to 2,000 hours of meditation and then come report back to me how much their experience has changed.
Okay.
And the reason I say that is those are thresholds that like your amygdala will have shrunk a lot. Your prefrontal cortex will have grown a lot. We see this even over 6 weeks of 30 minutes, but these are real brain neurological changes that are taking place. That's why when you're going through these things, they feel like a withdrawal. So you can have things that come up like depression or anxiety or loneliness or boredom or all these different shadow emotions that you maybe were kind of didn't know you were running from, but they're there. Those are just withdrawals of the conditioned self. And if you can stay with them, be present and metabolize them, they will just process through. But if you resist them or try to get rid of them, they'll stay.
Yeah, so, right.
Yeah.
What you resist persists.
Yes.
Yeah. So what role does self-love play in true healing?
Yeah, I would say that ultimately it plays most of the majority of the path. The reason I say that is like at the end, you realize there was no self. And I say that from the standpoint is that you're really loving the conditioned self until the conditioned self dissolves into the capital S self, which is the authentic self, which is what most spiritual traditions kind of like. They capitalize self as like the big S self and then the small S self. And so self-love is really the loving to the conditioned self, which is all the parts of you that didn't have the opportunity to be connected with from your parents or your family or your society or attuned to, and where you were not developed neurologically from. And so any part of you that has emotional pain is the part of you that you're going to avoid just naturally. And so that's why self-love is a requirement for healing, because we're wired for social survival. If you were to draw like a yin-yang symbol, right? One side of that yin-yang symbol would be social survival wire and nervous system, and the other side would be self-love. And until you master self-love, you can't have wholeness, right? So, and every part of it feels wrong because that's not how we're wired. And so that courage is really what's necessary. And that's why they say fear is the path home, is that like each part of the path, you have to have the courage to go into the fear. And the reason there's fear is because there's emotional pain and lack of development neurologically there. And so each layer of a cake, you could say the frosting would have fear, and then each cake, part of the cake would have one of the shadow emotions. And you sort of have to process and metabolize and digest that in the body until it becomes integrated, right? And integration is just a result of that process. It's not a separate thing. It's just like if you eat food, you just have to relax enough so you can allow it to process, right? But if you get too dissociated, meaning like in your mind and you get hypervigilant and you're like, you know, maybe riding a bike or whatever, there's no energy to digest that. It stays in your stomach. Well, we have this with all of our unprocessed emotions where we've constantly not created enough space. And the reason today's environment of mental and emotional health is not only the collective, meaning that like generational has accumulated because each generation's passing on their own trauma and their own unprocessed emotion and their own unhealthy compensations. But on top of that, we live in a world of unlimited distractibility, right? Like, and so like we're constantly requiring more and more input. And so it's leading to this huge level of congestion of unprocessed emotions that alter our mood, alter our nervous system, alter our energy. And so most people are walking around very sick, tired, and unhealthy. And emotional and mental health is the kind of the operating system to our quality of life. Like if your mood was fine all the time, people would be like, I'm good, you know, like I'm fine. But that's largely dictated on the ability for you to heal the past, right? And so those unprocessed emotions are essentially a sacred rebirth, right? Which is dictated through self-love and the ability to love all the parts of you that didn't get the love because of the social survival of what was required to allow you to be where you are today.
Right. If there's one message you want listeners to take away from this conversation, what would it be?
It would be to face your storm. You know, our storm is really the nature of our suffering within ourselves. And I think a lot of us are sort of socially taught to sort of fix the world or achieve a lot or make a lot of money, or, you know, a lot of that is really dictated around the freedom to move about the world in any way you want through financial independence. And the facing your storm is really about the freedom from. And this is really about the direction towards liberation, is that the path of most resistance, which is the experience of your storm within, is in fact what we really want. That's the ultimate value, right? If I said, hey, Tim, like, you wouldn't have triggers for the rest of your life. You'd have an experience of completely like feeling connected, safe, and loved. You know, that would be a lot more than $1 trillion in your bank account. Right. Because nothing could get you there. Right. And that would be the highest order of expression of health, because ultimately your conditioned self is what is communicating as a conduit to from your genomics to your epigenetics to your nutrition, to your lifestyle, your diet, because all those patterns are the conditioned self. What were you taught? You know, essentially, how are you reacting neurologically in a way that's causing changes in your genetic expression, which is epigenetics, which is your stress response to everything. And so this is the piece of facing your storm, because your conditioned self, where you suffer, is where your greatest unlocks to health and performance lie, is in between that. And so going in the path path of most resistance until there's no resistance is how you create and cultivate a sense of self-love. The fastest way out is in and through the body's storm of experience. And the way to get there is don't resist or don't react, don't resist, don't engage at the layer of the mind, and just feel and actually embrace and lean into all the areas of uncomfortability.
Easy.
Simple, but not easy.
Is there anything I missed? Anything I should have asked you that I didn't ask you?
No, I feel like we covered a lot of different content, a lot of the different areas that ultimately are things that are very like intimate to the way I practice and what like came about from my direct experience and my intellectual pursuits that allowed me to express myself the way I do is simply from the nature of the pain and initiation that took place that created the transformation. And I really do believe we are all on that path. Right. I think we all are initiated into this process through social survival. And the path home is really self-love. And that self-love allows for transformation. And I would just say that the biggest thing, which I said throughout this conversation, is that when you are healing, it almost always feels like you're going in the wrong direction. You know, and I think if there was one thing that I wish I knew when I was healing, because like oftentimes these layers are very cyclical and they happen in a spiral. So it's very possible that even if you heal, you'll revisit patterns. It doesn't mean you're taking a step back, but it can feel that way when you're going through the process. And this happens even with people relapse. The key to understand is that energy is sort of like neutral. And so energy that's unlocked through healing can fall back into old patterns. And so the ability to continue to practice self-love and grace and compassion and forgiveness to the self is one of the most fundamental things of importance, because you will enter phases that you will go what feels like backwards or feel like you're going back to the starting point, but you're not. It's an illusion. You're just in a pattern that's much more neurologically weak than it was before. And there's less pain than there was when that pattern was initiated from the compensation away from that pain, right? The patterns are usually the last thing to go in my experience. It's kind of like if you injured your ankle and you're like rehabbing, you compensated, you know, because you're avoiding the pain. You can see people like still compensating off of that pattern afterwards. Well, I see this very commonly in the nature of healing. It's like the pain will go away. And even in my own experience directly, like the pain is going away and it's still kind of like as if the compensation pattern is the way in which we know how to do things. And so being sure that, again, coming with a sense of grace and compassion and love and forgiveness, so that if you can give that to yourself, I assure you that you'll watch those things transform your relationships. And so the primary, you know, takeaway is really the nature of facing your storm and to bring a sense of presence, of sense of self-love, compassion and grace and self-forgiveness, and to know that you may revisit these patterns again and again. And at the same time, know that these things are non-linear. That's one of the biggest attributes of complex systems. My healing was super non-linear at the end. It was exponential, but that potentiation phase was happening the whole time. And I did experience less and less suffering along the way. And that's all that matters. A year from now, you'll experience less suffering than you did before. And the next year and so forth. And eventually, ultimately, that's all that matters. Whether you get to liberation doesn't matter, right? It just matters you suffer less. And so that is the key, is to stay with the process and stay devotional, meaning stay coming back to where you are, not trying to be somewhere where you're not, and be devotional by taking one step at a time and always be present, even if you re-enter patterns that have helped you survive in the past that may be pathological or at least create a lot of suffering for you, giving yourself grace.
Awesome. Wes, thank you so much. Where can people find you? How can they connect with you if they want to connect, if they want to come see you, if they want to learn more about you and your work?
Thank you, Tim. I appreciate it. It's great having this conversation with you, and also how much time that you spend helping people. I think I just want to mention this. You know, you are so devoted from your heart to transmuting the nature of your own experiences to help give back in service to others. I know that's why you do this podcast. I know that's why you have the clinic that you do. So I really, want to pass that along. I just have a deep appreciation and admiration for the way you've transmuted your own pain into love, connection, and healing for the people around you. It's very beautiful to witness, to watch. If people want to sort of follow me, I have an Instagram called Breakthrough Performance _rehab. And I put out quite a bit of content kind of periodically about ancient wisdom and sort of direct experiences that are helpful in terms of the transformational process. And that and my website, breakthroughperformance-rehab.com, are the two primary ways that people can connect with me.
Awesome. Wes, thank you so much. I appreciate you. And one of my favorite things to do every single week is go and see Wes. So Wes is always on my schedule. And if you want to go see Wes, he's always booked weeks in advance. So you won't be able to book an appointment and see him this week or next week, typically. So, but I'm all about it. So thanks again, Wes. I appreciate
it. It's such a pleasure to work with you. And it's been amazing to watch and witness your transformation. And it's very appreciative to work with you. It's one of the highlights of my week is just watching and witnessing how you show up. It's beautiful.
Awesome.
Thanks so much for listening to I Love Being Sober. I hope you got something valuable from today's episode. And if you're looking for more resources on recovery, mental health, or any of the therapies we talk about, head over to camelbackrecovery.com. You can find more episodes, blog posts, and ways to connect. Until next time, take care of yourself, keep growing, and keep living a kick-ass sober life.